American people, for the small business people who truly make America work, and the #1 job creators in our country. I yield back.
Thanks to my colleague, Mr. Tipton from Colorado. Mr. Speaker, we know that not all regulations are bad, but so many of them are obstacles to job creation. A recent study by the Heritage Foundation found that an unprecedented 43 major regulations were imposed in fiscal year 2010, with a total economic cost of $26.5 billion, the highest total since at least 1981. The cost of regulations is a big obstacle for American job creators. But when you think about regulations, here are just an example of some of the ones that can make you laugh. The Department of Energy requires microwave makers to measure the amount of energy their products use in the off position. The Environmental Protection Agency wants stricter regulations on the amount of dust on American farms. The Department of Interior wants to impose a fee on Christmas tree sales to promote Christmas tree sales. When you think about how government regulations destroy American jobs, these are the statistics that will make you cry. According to a Louisiana State University professor, the Department of Interior's de facto moratorium of exploration in the Gulf of Mexico could cost 36,137 jobs. In addition, more than 80,000 jobs could be lost due to the EPA regulations targeting the cement industry. And finally, EPA greenhouse gas regulations could cost 1.4 million jobs. The American people placed an upper limit on the damage that Washington Democrats could inflict on the economy by firing House Democrats in the last election. In January, we began to implement the Pledge to America, which is focused on providing an environment for economic growth and job creation. We voted to repeal the government takeover of health care, roll back costly Obama administration regulations, cut job-destroying spending, and change the culture of Washington, D.C. from one which talks about how much more they can spend to one which now talks about how much we can cut in spending. The United States Congress in 2009 passed the President's almost $800 billion stimulus package, which we now have convincing proof that it did nothing to reduce unemployment. Today, the House of Representatives has sent 9 real-life job-creating bills to the U.S. Senate, yet those bills continue to sit, waiting to be voted on, similar to the cut, cap, and balance that we sent over, that the Senate Majority Leader tabled. I have introduced my own piece of legislation to do my part to try to reduce unemployment, the Small Business Encouragement Act, H.R. 1663. The President continues with an economic policy based on job-killing overregulation, the specter of increased taxes, and the implementation of Obamacare. How many more months are we going to see this stagnant job growth? We are now at 29 months of unemployment in the United States of America, being at or above 9%. The President has to realize his policies have failed. They have failed the American people, and it is time to go in a different direction. The solution lies in economic, taxation, and regulatory policies which incentivize long-term private sector growth. We must restore confidence, provide access to capital, and create economic certainty. Now is not the time for more rhetoric on spending, borrowing, and raising taxes. Our country is in a crisis, and time is running out. We must remember that it is those same ma and pop stores on Main Street, back in our respective districts, that create the jobs for our teenagers during these summer months. It is the local hair salon back home that my wife and my 2 daughters visit often that will be affected by the uncertainty that persists throughout this nation. Economic uncertainty created by our massive federal debt, burdensome regulatory environment on small businesses, and uncertain tax policy for 2012 is slowing commerce, and we must turn the corner. Today's somber GDP announcement in the last quarter of 1.3% growth, and the previous quarter 0.5% growth, is further proof that President Obama's administration's economic strategy is not working. Unemployment still remains above 9%, at 9.2% nationally. In the inner city, in our black communities, it's at 16.2%. And unfortunately, for our veterans, of which I am one, that unemployment rate is 13%. And we just talked about our quarterly GDP growth. That is unacceptable for the most powerful economy in the world. Providing certainty for America's small businesses should be the #1 priority for Washington, considering they are the backbone of our nation's workforce and the engine of our economy. In May, House Republicans put forth a plan for America's job creators. That includes common sense policies to remove uncertainty by reducing regulatory burdens, lowering business tax rates to 25%, spurring exports by quickly passing the pending free trade agreements, and introducing a budget that gets our nation's fiscal house in order. The sooner we enact policies like these into law, the sooner our small businesses will be able to lead us out of this economic downturn. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been quite an eventful day here on the House floor. A lot of scurrying, a lot of things going on, committee rooms, different meeting rooms around the Capitol today. And actually, last night when I finished talking and meeting with folks, I don't know, midnight or so, it appeared that Republicans would start today with basically not much change to the bill we had yesterday. But we had a conference this morning, the Republican members of Congress, and added to the Boehner bill was the requirement that before the President would get the full tranche of the debt ceiling being lifted, there had to be a balanced budget amendment passed from the House with 2/3 vote, of course, and from the Senate with 2/3 vote, and be sent to the states by the archivist of the Capitol for their ratification. Now, it's a shame that a balanced budget amendment is needed, but if there could have been a piece of legislation that were prepared and passed that were tight enough to require always that a balanced approach be taken, no more money spent than money coming in, then we wouldn't have had to worry about a balanced budget amendment. But what we've seen over the last 100 years or so in this country has been runaway spending. And I think of the line Jim Carrey had in one of his movies, "Somebody stop me." And Congress needed somebody to stop Congress. But the only way to do that, constitutionally and legally, was to change the Constitution so that Congress could be stopped from spending more money than it took in. I was going to vote no on the Boehner bill as of yesterday, as of last night. But this morning, to find out that the Speaker, as he said he would, has listened to the conference and put back in the balanced budget amendment requirement. It already had a requirement in there that there would be a vote, but we knew that the Senate had already voted 51 votes to table the balanced budget amendment. They didn't even want to debate it. And now, tonight, as I speak, the Senate has wasted no time with the majority leader of the Senate, a Democratic Party leader. I would bet that he has not bothered to read the bill, that he's not bothered to see what's there, and perhaps the Majority Leader Reid does not know that 70% or so of all American adults would like to see a balanced budget amendment passed. Tonight, again, he is working against the will of the American people, just like he and then Speaker Pelosi did in pushing for Obamacare to be passed, though a majority of Americans did not want that kind of government intrusion into their lives. Well, the Democrats still control the Senate, so once again they're working their private will against the will of the American people. So as I speak, I don't know what the tally is that was being taken as I walked onto the floor, but I would imagine that Leader Reid would not have brought the Boehner bill with the requirement of having a balanced budget amendment passed by 2/3 to the floor of the Senate unless he knew once again he had the 51 Democratic senators who were willing to vote to table the bill that has required so much sweat. I don't know if there are any tears, but there are a lot of sweat and a lot of frustration. I know I've had plenty. Anger at times, frustration. But we came together and got the bill done. And I ended up being a yes for a number of reasons, but one was, the most important was, that the balanced budget amendment was going to be required to pass 2/3 of the House and Senate before the President got the debt ceiling increase that he so desperately wants. To table that, once again, it's bad enough that the Senate all this time has been trashing things that we've been fighting for and getting accomplished in the House. But to table it, you're not even going to let Republicans who want to speak on this issue come to the floor of the Senate and have a fair debate simply because one party controls the majority. You want to keep the other side from coming to the Senate floor and having a fair debate over a balanced budget amendment. It is just staggering to think that once again, just like when Obamacare was crammed down the throats of Americans, not with any sugar, it was a sour piece of medicine, and now not even to allow debate over a balanced budget amendment to be brought to the Senate floor. I don't think the founders intended that. I don't think the founders intended that when 70% or so of the Americans felt something was critical for the ongoing and good of the country, that you would have one group in either house who would prohibit even discussing, debating a bill, using the rules and 51 senators to prevent debate. I mean, that's how this country, one of the things that's helped make it great. This was the one place you used to could say whatever you wanted. As it's been credited to different people, but I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And now it appears the Senate is operating under a rule. I disagree with what you say, so I am going to use procedural maneuvers and prevent you from saying what you want to say. And I'll say this about Speaker John Boehner, too. He knows that I have not been happy with many of the things that have gone on. But unlike the majority leader in the Senate, he has made no effort to prevent me from coming to the House floor and speaking my mind, such as it is, here on this floor. We're supposed to have freedom of speech, but the Senate will not allow the working of the people's will on the Senate floor. Now, I've heard some people say, Mr. Speaker, that the fact is, by our passing this bill today in the House, that we've provided a vehicle for the Senate to use to completely strip out and put some contorted piece of legislation on and send back down here. Well, the fact is that the Senate did not need this bill today to have a vehicle to send a contorted piece of legislation back toward us. Now, the Constitution makes clear anything that produces revenue has to originate in the House. That's the Constitution. But it is also important for people to understand, Mr. Speaker, the lengths to which the rules have been twisted and I think misused in order to make something happen that never should have. And a good example is this monstrosity, some called Obamacare. It's got different names. But the original name of this bill was, quote, an amendment, H.R. 3590, and it calls it the bill from the House of Representatives. So this was a Senate bill. Obamacare was a Senate bill, started in the Senate, derived in the Senate. Well then, since the Democrats raised revenue in Obamacare, created new taxes, increased taxes, well, that's a revenue-generating bill, then how in the world could the Senate originate the bill since it generated revenue? Because the Constitution makes very clear they can't do that. Well, what the Senate did was take H.R. 3590, entitled, quote, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modify the first-time home buyer's credit in the case of members of the armed forces and certain other federal employees and for other purposes. That's Obamacare. And I would humbly submit that any bill that starts as a lie, because this bill was a lie, a bill that starts as a lie can't be a very good bill in the end. We know that any building that has a proper foundation can weather a lot of storms. This bill has a lie for a foundation. The Obamacare bill is H.R. 3590, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modify the first-time homebuyer's credit in the case of members of the armed forces. And they had to do double page, and this paper is very, very thin, so they could get all this stuff in here. But it is interesting, you know, the bill started as a bill to help veterans and our military, but this bill to help veterans and our military, those who are putting their lives at risk for our liberty, for our benefit, that was stripped out. And this Obamacare bill begins with page 1, line 1 of the bill to help our veterans and military, and strikes every single word, deleting every single word in the bill to help veterans and our military, and substitutes, therefore, Obamacare. That bill started as a lie. They took a bill that had nothing to do with health care, and they stripped every word that would help our military and made it Obamacare. That is phenomenal. Just incredible. So the Senate didn't need us to pass a bill today for them to do the same thing, to take some well-intentioned bill, some bill that did some great things for America, beginning at line 1, page 1, and continuing to delete every word in the bill through the end of the bill, and substituting, therefore, whatever contorted mess that the Senate's going to send down here. But the thing is, though some of the Senate leadership have been taking their shots in the media at the House, they have not passed anything. They have fought now, today makes twice, as the nation moves toward not having enough money, while the House has been embroiled in serious debate and discussions trying to put together a bill, and we did that, and it had 234 votes, and the Senate immediately tabled. Now, the truth is, I thought we should wait for the Senate to do anything, and I disagreed with the Speaker's strategy. But the Speaker's strategy was, well, if they won't take that, then let's try again. We will compromise on the things that we want and send a bill that's clearly a compromise of the things we want. So surely the Senate will take it up, and surely they will pass it. We had heard from Majority Leader Reid that he was going to make sure it was dead on arrival, but those kind of things have been threatened before, too. We know the President's drawn many lines in the sand that kept moving. And we've heard the President talk about his bill. And I can recall sitting right back there during the September speech by the President in here on health care, in which he kept talking about his bill, my bill, this bill, and don't misrepresent my bill or I'll call you out. And he was the first one to use the word lie here on the House floor, talking about what he believed to be misrepresentations of his bill. And I asked the Secretary, HHS, a couple of weeks after that, you know, the President keeps talking about his bill, my bill, this bill, my bill, this bill. Where can I get a copy of the President's bill? And Secretary Sebia said, I think he was talking about a set of principles. Aha, I was right. The President talked about this bill, my bill, this bill, my bill, but he had no bill. Yep. People talked about how beautiful his clothes were, but the fact was the emperor was naked. There was no bill. There was no bill then. And now, as the President talks about his bill, his ideas, there's no bill. As Harry Reid talks about his bill, there is no bill. Maybe they'll finally get around to passing something. There's something been filed in the Senate, and as I understand it, Chairman Dreyer's filed it down here so that we can take it up. We'll see what happens. But the phenomenal thing is how badly off track this Congress has gotten when one of the houses, in this case the Senate, will not even allow debate over something that the vast majority of Americans want. Forget Democrat, forget Republican, forget red, forget blue. Let's get responsible. $160 billion in deficit spending, 2006, my second year here, was not responsible. And Democrats won the majority as a result because they promised we'll eliminate that $160 billion deficit spending. And man, oh man, were they right. They eliminated $160 billion in deficit spending. And now this year, as a result of their actions, the last four, we will have $1.6 trillion in spending deficit this year, bringing in around $2.2 trillion. We find out today the numbers from the first quarter of this year, which was very little growth at all in our economy, which people got depressed about when the original numbers came out, was about a third of what they originally thought it was. Things aren't looking good. This is President Obama. It's his economy. With the changes that Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Reid made in the first 2 years of this president's tenure, they set us on a track that is leading to a major crash. Now, we've already heard in recent days that the August 2nd deadline that the president set, just like I said some weeks back, that was not a particularly special day. It did happen to be the day before the president's big birthday celebration, but otherwise it was not a particularly significant day. And I know the group that Tom Daschle helped start, the bipartisan so-called policy center, or partisan policy center, whatever it is, that they were echoing whatever the president said, that August 2nd was going to be the day, when the fact is, and they lumped in Social Security with everything else. The law is very clear. Social Security gets paid. It's on automatic pilot. And just like in 1985 and just like in 1996, when there's a shortfall 1 month, the Treasury Secretary is supposed to sell off some of the Treasury notes. There's $2.6 trillion in Treasury notes. Sell off enough to pay the benefits and expenses of Social Security. So there's no risk of that failing. We also know there are many times more than enough money to pay our debts as they come due in August. And so we've been told, well, actually it's not August 2nd now. Maybe it's more like a couple of weeks or a couple of weeks beyond that. We're just not sure, but sometime in the future. Well, in the House, it's been taken seriously, even though August 2nd was not particularly a magic date. And we have passed 2 bills, and the Senate has passed 0. That's irresponsible. Absolutely irresponsible. That invokes no confidence that this government will ever be able to do what it needs to. So I know I've gotten emails, we've gotten calls, we've gotten letters. Members of Congress all over the floor on both sides of the aisle have gotten calls and letters. And the majority of those in my office have encouraged me to stand firm. And it's great to represent a district that understands not to cave in to fear-mongering. And it has been rough in recent days, because you never like to be chided by friends who don't like the position you're taking on a bill. But I'm ever so grateful that the bill was made eminently better this morning by adding the requirement that the Balanced Budget Act pass. And not only that, talking through the day, and I do appreciate Speaker Boehner, face-to-face, eye-to-eye. He has been very gracious all week. It's others that have made it kind of tough at times, but he realized something needed to be done. He wants to do something. So in talking with him and also talking with Chairman Paul Ryan, the chairman of the Budget Committee, I'm also satisfied that we've got a number of wonderful things coming. We can perhaps figure at some point the Senate will get concerned about going against the will of the majority of the Senate. At some point, they're going to realize we should not keep going against 70% of the American public because a lot of us have got elections next year. So, gee, maybe we better do something that the majority of Americans want. Well, one of the things that I heard Rush Limbaugh talking about in the 90s, when Congress was not even a blip on my radar, was the zero baseline budget. And it didn't make any sense to me as he explained it. I thought, that's strange. Because as it was explained, we have automatic increases in every agency's budget in the federal government. Every agency has automatic increases every year. Well, senior citizens don't get automatic COLAs, but their agencies sure get an automatic increase every year. All those budgets, they get automatic increases. Why? We ought to have a zero baseline budget every year so nobody gets an automatic increase in the government agencies. That if they want an increase, they ought to have to come in and prove it. And we could save trillions of dollars if we just required every budget in the federal government to start out and prove what they need for the year. A zero baseline budget, no automatic increases. Well, when I got to Congress and sworn in January of 2005 and start looking at the things that would make America stronger, a zero baseline budget made sense. And during that Congress, I filed a bill to require a zero baseline budget. No automatic increases every year. And then back in those days, it didn't make sense. The Republicans wouldn't bring that to the floor because anytime you slowed the automatic increase as a Congress, there were people that called you a draconian fool. You're making draconian cuts. When all you were doing, you weren't making cuts. You were just slowing the rate of growth. It wasn't a cut. And the only way to fix that was just say no automatic increases. And I pushed for that in my first Congress in 2005 and 2006, and Republicans were in the majority, and our leadership at that time, particularly in 2006, when I talked with some of our leadership then, and I was pushing it, I was told, you know, we just can't do that. We should have, we didn't. We should have had major tax reform. Well, now's the time. This is a great time to push for a flat tax or a simplified tax that's fairer, simpler, and so that everybody has their fair share. I don't want a mega-rich person paying a 10 or 12% income tax. Everybody ought to have some interest financially in what happens here, and not because they make lots of money and don't put anything in. People need to have a vested interest in this Congress by paying income tax in. And the lowest rate is down, I believe, around 15%, or it may be 5%. I've forgotten now. But the top rate has been 39%. Some people want it to go higher. And even though the top rate's 39%, there are some mega-rich that don't pay 39%. Well, why not have a tax that's a fair tax cut across the middle that will be a flat tax? Everybody will pay the same amount of tax. That ought to be fair. Everybody ought to have the same thing. And Art Laffer, a great economist that helped revive the dismal economy coming out of the Carter administration, was just saying this week, I agreed with what he said. I've been talking about this, and I appreciate that man's opinion so much. He said we ought to have a flat tax. And he said, I believe you could get there and have the same amount of revenue if you were to have a 12, 13% flat tax and even allow for mortgage deduction, mortgage interest deduction, and to allow deductions for charitable contributions. And there was that was the main part of the tax. There was another aspect, but boy, that would be so much more fair. No mega rich would get out without paying nothing. GE shouldn't, have to pay nothing, get away with paying nothing just because they're friends of the administration and get lobbying and all that kind of stuff. Everybody ought to have to pay something. I'm okay with reducing corporate tax because when you do that, you're reducing the tariff we're putting on our own products. And if you took off the 35% tariff we put on every corporate American good produced, there's no telling how many markets around the world would just be begging for American products that would be 35% less of a tariff on those goods. We could compete anywhere if we keep the tariff down on our own goods. People talk about putting tariffs on other people's goods. We ought to get it off our own. And then you would see massive amount of economic booming going on, and people would be hired, and more people would pay the 12, 13% income tax. You'd have more revenue than ever coming into the American coffers of the federal government. That would create jobs, and as people know, the best form of welfare is a job. You feel good about yourself. But it's hard to feel too good about what's going on down there. And as I've said before, down in the Senate, above the door, from the President's sitting position in the Senate, above the left door is the words, Annuit Coeptus. He, God, has smiled on our undertaking. It's part of our Great Seal on the back of every dollar bill. It's hard to believe that God could be smiling on people that will not allow debate on a responsible, balanced budget amendment. Mr. Speaker, I ask how much time?
Sure. Approximately 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you. In the time I have left, I'll just say we've gotten so many calls, emails, letters, encouragement, and so many of them say, we're praying for you in Washington that you'll do the right thing. Some of us happen to believe, and I don't try to push my religious beliefs on others, but some of us happen to believe that, as we're told in the Old Testament, that the Lord is the source of all wisdom. That there is no wisdom outside of that. Ben Franklin apparently believed that, as he said in 1787, that I've lived so a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men. Well, Peter Marshall was Senate chaplain back in the 1940s, and a constituent gave me this book with many of the prayers that he prayed there on the Senate floor. And I want to finish, Mr. Speaker, with a prayer prayed by Peter Marshall, U.S. chaplain for the United States Senate in the 1940s. And on the Senate floor, as the senators are down there, it makes a wonderful prayer. Peter Marshall prayed, we pray to thee, O Christ, to keep us under the spell of immortality. May we never again think and act as if thou wert dead. Let us more and more come to know thee as a living Lord, who hath promised to them that believe, because I live, ye shall live also. Help us to remember that we are praying to the conqueror of death, that we may no longer be afraid nor be dismayed by the world's problems and threats, since thou hast overcome the world. In thy strong name we ask for thy living presence and thy victorious power. Amen. Peter Marshall, 1940s, U.S. Senate floor. Mr. Speaker, may that be our prayer also tonight. I yield back.
Does this gentleman have a motion?
Mr. Speaker, I move that we do now hereby adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until noon tomorrow.